We're currently in Limehouse and it's a very rainy day, as you can see, so I'll do my best to tell you this tale despite the morbid British weather, which I think suits not just my mood but the tale itself. Limehouse was a very, very busy place for industry. It's very difficult to summarise just how bustling and important this location always was. For instance, to my left, you're right, this is Ropemakers Fields, which runs down into the park, and this is Narrow Street. Ropemakers Fields indicating the rope makers. This wasn't just a place for the dockyard workers, but importantly, it was a very important place for the sailors of the previous centuries, which is why you get sailors' hostels in Limehouse to this day. You can still see they're not used as sailors' hostels anymore, but they still clearly represent what they were used for in the past. Now, this was a very crime-ridden, troublesome location. Nothing like today. Today it's quite exclusive. It's a lot safer today than it would have been in the past. During the epoch of someone like Dickens, for instance, this would have been problematic. It would have had wealth and incredible poverty. Places like this that people like Dickens would take the hardships and the difficulties that were going on from living conditions down to working conditions to create his stories. Because as we know, Dickens mainly wrote things that were relatively depressing, relatively dark, which is why I think I connect with them, because it's a great reminder as to the woe which befell many of our ancestors. Now, where we are here now is directly opposite the Grapes pub. Now, this pub claims to originally be 16th century. So it claims to have first been built in the 1500s. We're very lucky to still have it because this location, due to its bustling industry all the way up through the 30s and 40s, was heavily targeted by the Luftwaffe during the World War II bombing blitz. So you will see in these beautiful rows of terrace houses and old factories, you will see gaps that there's modern buildings that have been put in, and that's most likely because of the blitz as opposed to just modernisation. Now, as well as there being a lot of dockers and sailors here, there was a lot of migrants here, and a huge portion of the Chinese migrant community found themselves in Limehouse. This is where the opium craze really came to life, and that's where you see it involved in the Sherlock Holmes stories and others like it, and this is where they got their ideas from. Eventually, because of that, they would be moved further up to near Leicester Square opposite Soho, where you know Chinatown today. But it would be irresponsible of us to ridicule the Chinese community of the past if we was to look into the opium wars that the British Empire was responsible for around the same time. So it's multifaceted, incredibly interesting topics, and Limehouse was the place that it all happened. Today though, we're here to, as I said, look at the Grapes, which has a very special owner, but I'll mention that in just a moment. And you will get a lot of very influential or interesting people pop by in little pubs like the Grapes in these little areas that you'd be surprised that they pop in. But when you find out who owns the pub, you won't be so surprised. So this little beauty that we're lucky to have, this survivor of the Blitz, is actually owned by Ian McKellen, who you will most famously know as the actor that played Gandalf. Very famous actor, but for those of you that are unfamiliar, that's the part that he will most spring out in your mind. Now, the actual building was rebuilt in the 1700s, apparently in the 1720s. Once again, I have to highlight how fortunate it is that the bombs of the Blitz did miss this building, because there's lots of buildings that we've lost which are very important, but the public house was more than just a factory. A factory is where people earned their wages, whereas a pub is a place where people earned their wages, policed, met partners, it's impossible to measure the amount of things that actually went on within the public houses of Britain. So we're going to go inside. As you can see, we're here a little bit early to avoid the massive queues that can form on the outside. Before I even mention the art, look at this snug here. You can see the architecture of the pub is incredibly wholesome. Despite it being very narrow and somewhat pokey inside, it's still a lot more wholesome and welcoming than a humongous Wetherspoons in a new build. But I particularly love this. I was struck by these paintings when I walked in. And if you come over here for me, this one I particularly liked because it showed the people within the pub living their life of an evening, and you see this couple here embracing, and I find that really touching. As well as you see here, there's the writer who's having a bit of a think in between sentences. The group of lads here, and for me, paints a much better picture. Genuinely paints a much better picture than if this was all just sort of tacky art that you get in many pubs now. And if you just turn around here, just like if we was at Town of Ramsgate, Prospect of Whitby, there are an assortment of beautiful old photographs and paintings that do justice to the property. First class. Now inside in the beautiful bar, you can actually see this staff here. Now, unfortunately, we're not sure where the real staff from the actual real story of Lord of the Rings went, but we've got the actors' imitation one, apparently. We don't know where the real ring went either, but apparently we have got the staff. So, all we can do is admire the imitation. But it's one of the many reasons that if you are a Lord of the Rings fanatic, this is probably where you're going to want to come most. So there's only X amount of pubs left on the Thames that actually have balconies. They may have little gardens or something like that, but the actual balcony that overlooks the River Thames, which was a view so many of our ancestors were very used to throughout previous centuries, that's becoming very few and far between. Even the Angel in Rotherhithe, the balcony is becoming somewhat structurally unsound, so it's no longer safe to walk on. Maybe it is since our last visit, but the Town of Ramsgate, the view's not what it could be. The Prospect of Whitby, at the minute, they're not letting people go out on that balcony either. So balconies such as this really are special. I mean, you could go to the Isle of Dogs and sit at the gun, but then your view is sort of ruined by North Greenwich and the Millennium Dome. So this is a very special view. Now, when the tide is in, unfortunately, this is very violent. You wouldn't necessarily want to walk out here. Same as the pavements, they can all become completely flooded with water. But this is one of the final views where one can actually enjoy the riverbank from the pub, as was done in previous centuries. So let's hope that some of the pubs that may listen to this will either fix their balconies or put some up.